Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Katie Stallard. Katie is senior editor for China and Global Affairs at the New Statesman magazine. She's also a Wilson Center Global Fellow and the author of this book, Dancing on Bones: History and Power in China, Russia, and North Korea. Katie, welcome and congratulations on getting to the finish line on this terrific book.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you. You have contributed in ways both witting and unwitting to this book through conversations at the Wilson Center over many years.
Unwitting is my usual best contribution to anything, but thank you. It was a pleasure. We won't do this in a linear fashion, even though the book provides history lessons in a very linear fashion. I'm going to bounce around a bit, and I want to go back several years initially and ask you when the idea first occurred to you that this was a book that you started to connect dots about what you knew about these three countries and started to conceptualize this as a book.
Yeah, so I think it was really the Victory Day parade in Beijing in September 2015. It was quite soon after I had arrived there. I had previously been posted in Moscow covering Russia and Ukraine. And when I covered that parade, it felt like this enormous, very consequential event that, the pageantry, all of the extraordinary choreography suggested it must have been a tradition that had been in place for the last 70 years, marking the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. But in fact, it was the first time that parade had ever happened. Putin was there as Xi's guest of honor. And I was really struck by what was driving that decision then. What was it that was driving the current regime to draw on the history of this war and really bring it back to such prominence? And having just come from covering Russia and seeing how prominent the profile and the history of the war was there and the role it was already playing in the early stages of the war in Ukraine, I was really struck by how these two regimes were drawing on this period of their history and the role it was playing in their current politics. So, with hindsight, I think it was that standing at that parade and hearing the echoes of this history there that made me start thinking about, well, what's going on here? What's the story behind all of this?
And you describe it as a multi-year quest to understand how autocrats exploit history to stay in power. And I want to ask you about your process, because this book is a combination of traditional scholarly research, but also firsthand reporting, even to the point where a lot of the photographs contained in the book are photos you shot yourself, and then a lot of anecdotal encounters with individuals. Talk to us about how all of the pieces came together.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is how the third country came to be part of it, North Korea, was then, so being based in Beijing and already starting to think about how China and Russia were using this history. I started reporting a lot on North Korea and then eventually got the chance to travel there and report on the ground in North Korea. And I was really struck by how present the regime's version of history was there, how much, again, they were drawing on this period of their history, and in their case, quite a ludicrously distorted version of that history in their current politics. So I started trying to look across all three countries, but I was really clear from the start. I mean, first and foremost, I felt I have to come to this as myself. I am a reporter. I'm a journalist. I'm not an academic. So I should approach this as myself, as a reporter. Getting on the ground to the extent that I can, speaking to terrible journalistic phrase, but real people as much as we can, and trying to look at how does this play out in real life and on the ground. I really wanted it to be a book that would take you there and try and give you the experience of standing on the ground in all three of these countries and trying to understand this from the inside out, rather than sort of standing from afar and declaiming about politics in these three countries. So I wanted to put readers there on the ground and try to understand how this works in real life, and then do the hard work of slogging through the articles, the academic literature, the archives, and try and piece together the theory behind the practice, so that hopefully it would feel relevant and it would feel like something where the point of the book was to understand how this history matters in real life. So beyond the ivory tower.
Well, mission accomplished on all counts. The book is essentially about the power of myth and how it can be either weaponized or operationalized, perhaps is a less subjective term. And myths can be very specific to cultures. But in the stories you tell, there's a lot of commonality when an autocrat is using history and a version of history to stay in power. Can you talk to us about what are the common touch points that seem to be almost universal?
Yes, I want to be clear that there are important differences between these three countries and in the approaches that the ruling regime talks. There are really important and critical differences between the three. But I think the common part of all three of these national myths is this idea that the country has been attacked and has been victimized and has suffered in the past, that it has been denied what was previously, a glorious and great history, and been attacked by these external enemies, and that then it has redeemed itself in all three cases through strength, in the person of strong national leaders, military strength, and in a populace that's uniting behind these strong leaders to defend their countries. And that really serves the current leadership extremely well, because that's the lesson that they want the population to draw now. They all want to again claim that they're facing, some degree of external threat from these outside enemies, and that anyone who is a patriot, who wants to see the country prosperous and secure and go on to a great and glorious future, should once again unite behind these strong leaders and push back against these enemies, which in some cases are largely fictional. But it's an effective story. These are powerful tales that these leaders are telling.
Yeah, threats require a savior. And in the case of these saviors, you're even talking about using Hollywood conventions. I think in the case of North Korea, you even talked about employing a screenwriter to help tell the story. Talk about those elements as well. And you mentioned untrue, largely true, somewhat true. How important is truth in this entire storytelling exercise? At what point does it become secondary to convenient truths that don't necessarily hold with scrutiny?
I think all effective propaganda has a glimmer of truth at its core. And in all three of these cases, one of the things that is so effective about these stories is that they are genuinely resonant. The experiences that the Soviet Union and China had in the Second World War, and the casualties there, which were in the tens of millions, these conflicts really did touch almost every family in these countries. So they really do produce genuine emotional resonance in the way that just entirely manufactured propaganda would not. And in the case of the North Korean story, and you talk about the early myth building around Kim Il-sung, but part of what was critical to that was that he was genuinely a guerrilla fighter. He was a young man who had fought against the Japanese. So that part of the story was true, but they took that initial core of the story and then over the decades turned it into this extraordinary Hollywood-esque tale where he by the current iteration of this story, he is almost single-handedly liberating the Korean Peninsula from Japan in 1945. There's an extraordinary, powerful description of how he and his band of guerrillas make this triumphant charge down the Korean Peninsula, vanquish the Japanese, and the whole land erupts in celebration of Kim Il-sung and his miraculous leadership, which didn't happen. But is a very effective story, and it has enabled the regime to build their mythology around the core of truth and of the real suffering that the country experienced, both under Japanese colonial rule and then later during the Korean War.
When reading that story and others in the book, I kept thinking back to what Joseph Campbell says about mythology, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be true in all of its details, but what it does is unveil a greater truth. And that seems to be the way that you're describing this as far as the resonance of the stories. Whether the details matter or not, the story resonates in a way that speaks to a certain truth for these countries.
Yeah, and again, it's probably important to say that this isn't unique to these autocratic leaders and these authoritarian regimes. We're talking here in the United States, where World War to history is an important cultural touchstone. I grew up in the UK, where we hear the stories about the Blitz spirit, about Churchill, about the small island that would never surrender. That's baked into our popular mythology too, and it's very seductive. It's part of how leaders appeal to the populace, is to paint this image of who we are as a nation and where we might go under their leadership. So it's an effective political tool wherever it's used. The difference, and I thought was important to look at it in these three countries, is what happens when you can't challenge that, when all you have is the great and the glorious official myth, and the individual historians and the critical aspects of that history and the terrible atrocities that also took place are ignored and are airbrushed out of the history, and then all you have is this bombastic, triumphant official version, which really only serves the men, and they are all men in these cases at the top.
And it's clear that you struggle with that question throughout the book, in that whether people really believe this or not, whether they're just playing along because they understand there's a lot of pressure to publicly pronounce that they are supporters of these leaders. And so I guess the question is, and you also make the case strongly, as you did now, that this is not unique to autocratic countries or individuals, that this happens throughout the world of politics, storytelling, George Washington chopping down cherry trees and never telling lies. Every country has its demigod-like historical figures. But what is the line? Is there a line, Katie, where this clearly becomes something that's dangerous now and no longer just politics or propaganda as usual?
Well, I think, that question started for me in North Korea during a reporting trip, interviewing a lady who's featured in the book, who's an elementary school teacher, and who's, we're talking in her apartment. It's a very intimate, personal moment. She's showing us around her bedroom, all of her cherished belongings, and she's, her eyes are filling with tears as she talks about these the great leaders, and how terribly grateful she is to the descendants of the Kim family. And I was probably 2-3 feet away from her, looking at her in the eyes and thinking, I just have no way to know whether you really believe what you're telling me right now, because I have my two minders with me, standing either side of me, writing down everything that she's saying. Of course, they know who she is, and she's agreed to be part of the interview. So I felt, I was fascinated by how much of this do people really believe, how much of what I'm seeing here is real. And I guess the point I came out to on the book on that is that, in a sense, it doesn't really matter that once the propaganda and the repression in these societies, it is at such levels that the only pronouncements you can make in public is that you do believe, and that you do have complete faith in these leaders and their messaging, that these stories almost become a method of control in themselves, that it's a way to make sure that nobody really knows, including the two minders who were there with me. Nobody really knows for sure what other people believe. So the safest thing becomes to repeat the official line, to repeat the propaganda in public, and these stories, so that they in themselves become tools of repression. And I think we're seeing that to an extent now in Russia. I was somewhat skeptical before the invasion of Ukraine how well this story would hold up. When this was just a glorious myth that was being paraded out every year, and as part of the Victory Day celebrations. It's one thing to take part in that and to repeat those lines. But I thought that once the toll started to be really felt, once the economy was affected, once young Russians were coming back in soldiers, once young Russian soldiers were coming back in coffins, that this would really start to undermine the official narrative, and that it wouldn't be as successful as it had previously looked. But I was wrong. All the evidence that we have so far is that with the tightening of the information environment there, and with the increased repression that we're seeing, that actually the official story is holding up. And to the extent that we can measure it, there is support for this war, and there is buy-in to the regime's lies.
Time will tell if there's a tipping point in that regard, right? But when you look, say, back to North Korea, a country that lives with lots of impoverishment, while money is directed to things like nuclear weapons programs, people are seeing that too, right? They're living that every day. Why doesn't that serve as a counterweight to the narratives that are sold from the top?
I think the effort in all three cases is to take all of that blame, all of those questions about where is the money going, and to shift all of that anger outside, beyond the regime. I think what all of these countries need is a bogeyman. I mean, less so in China certainly until recently, when they've been able to point to very robust economic growth as a tool for regime legitimacy. But certainly in North Korea, the answer to everything, and you see the various Kim leaders lean on this at times of crisis, is to say that this is all happening to us because of the hostile policy of our enemies. This is all the result of the imperialist blockade. This is all the result of the anti-socialist alliance targeting our country. So it's about taking that blame and that dissatisfaction and that anger with the regime and diverting it away outside onto these external enemies.
Why does popular support even matter to a dictator?
So I think Timothy Fry explains this really well in his recent book, Weak Strong Man, on Vladimir Putin, when he talks about it. It's much easier to be a popular autocrat than an unpopular autocrat. So I think there can be a tendency sometimes from the outside to assume that these guys just rule through repression, that they're sort of almost Bond villain-esque, running the country from these tables at the heart of their respective fortresses, pulling levers and the population falling into line. In fact, in all three cases, they're making quite a concerted effort to appeal to popular support, which serves the purpose of showing their own regime elite and the crucial, what have been called the selectorate, the top circle within these regimes, that they are the leader who can best carry the support of the public, and therefore everyone whose benefits, whose income, whose ability to access graft depends on that leader in power, that their future is secure. Where it starts to become dangerous for leaders in authoritarian regimes is when either they look to be seriously ill, or they look like they might be unpopular and about to fall out of power, because then you get this jockeying and this succession to decide, well, who replaces them. So as long as they look popular, they look strong. So it's in their interests to try and maintain that image that they are genuinely popular, and therefore there's no need to think about trying to push them out of power and trying to get somebody else in instead.
How do you think about the impact of technology? An argument can be made that makes it more difficult to maintain a lie because people are exposed to more information at this moment in history than any of us ever have been in any previous generation. On the other hand, the tools of spreading propaganda and spreading lies are readily available to everyone now at low costs, essentially. So how do you square this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing that even in very robust democratic societies like our own,
Sure.
with completely free access to any part of the internet. It is entirely possible to insulate yourself within an information bubble and buy in heavily to conspiracy theories and official myths. And I think we're seeing, I mean, when I started this project, Russia had a relatively open internet, and it was the case that you could, Russian state television was by far the dominant source of news for particularly for the older generation, but that was being eroded somewhat by social media, by encrypted messaging channels like Telegram. But over time, those avenues have been closed down. Access to independent media has been closed down, and it's really just a small part of the population now that is able to still access those sites and those sources of information beyond the regime's controls, and use things like virtual private networks to browse outside of the country. So I think you see the regimes co-opt these technologies and try to try to seal off access to outside sources of information, and in the case of North Korea, also use that technology again as a form of control. So they're experimenting with technology that will make it possible to trace with a digital fingerprint, where for instance a video critical of the regime has come from, it will be possible to trace that back. So I think that the great hope that we had back in the I think it was the early 2000s, when the internet was going to be like nailing jello to a wall for these dictators, that they've succeeded in nailing the jello to the wall and turning that technology to their own advantage, and then flooding these information channels too with their own propaganda messages. So I think unfortunately technology is not going to be the savior here.
Do you? I know that I know you well enough to know that your journalistic standards are at the highest level. So I know you're not going to engage in wild speculation. But do you have any hope that truth finds a way eventually?
Yeah, I mean, working on this book, one of the things that was most inspiring to me was the way that individual historians, scholars, citizen journalists are continuing to push back at extraordinary personal risk. That is not the case so much in North Korea, although there are people who are working within that country to get information out and to try and inform views of North Korea in the outside world. But particularly in the case of both Russia and China, really principled, brave scholars are still doing the work of trying to challenge these national narratives and trying to insist on the ability to tell the truth and reclaim their own historical memory. So I think that's what gives me hope here, is that even under these very draconian restrictions, there are still plenty of people who are pushing back and who are saying, no, you're not going to rewrite history for me. I'm going to stick to my principles, and I'm going to insist on, there is such a thing as objective truth, and I'm going to try and write it down and document it for future generations.
So I promised to be nonlinear, and so I'm going to do that. And I want to go back to something that I meant to mention earlier that was fascinating in the book, and that is the way the myths evolve and are handed off from leader to leader. And sometimes one line of narrative is abandoned. I think of Russia and Stalin, and then I think of how it's then reemerges under a new leader. It's pretty interesting to see that there is almost a plan of secession that's not orderly and not democratic, but seems to work in the case of these three countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you tend to see when a new leader comes to power is this kind of casting around for a national idea, for something to rally support behind and to stake their regime upon. And I think, in the case of Russia, that's quite explicit. Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s actually holds a contest to try and come up with a national idea for Russia, now post-Soviet Union. And actually comes up empty-handed. They don't come up with anything. Whereas Putin, just decides quite early on that for him, he is going to draw heavily on the history of the Soviet Union. He starts to reintroduce Soviet symbols, and he seizes on the history of the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as it's known there, early on, as something that's going to be effective in rallying support behind. But I think one thing I was most struck by was just how much the profile of this history has come and gone over the years. I mean, I think when you see, the profile of the Victory Day celebrations in Red Square under Vladimir Putin, you just, again, assume that this has always been the case. But actually, when you trace it back to the end of the war and Stalin himself, this war has been suppressed. At times it's been pushed out of view. Yeltsin himself was wary of it because he was concerned that his political rivals in the Communist Party would benefit if he focused too heavily on this period of the history. So that period of history is powerful, and successive leaders have taken really quite different approaches to it over the years.
Yeah, that part of the book was a real eye opener for me as well. I think I'm informed about these things, but I was really surprised at really how fluid it has been and how things come and go over time.
Yeah, I mean, in the Chinese case too, I think looking at, it really wasn't until after Mao Zedong had died and into the Deng era in the 1980s that the story of the war there was really properly reconsidered. Because again, you had this kind of concern, for certainly when Mao was in power, that Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang on Taiwan might benefit from the revival of this narrative. They were the ones who had done most of the fighting and dying in the war, and too much focus on the war might benefit Chiang and the KMT. So, it is sometimes only after these, in this case, Mao and Chiang had gone, that then the Communist Party leadership was prepared to look at this seriously and revise the story of the war now to include the KMT's sacrifice once they weren't anymore a contemporary threat and as the then leadership was interested in outreach to Taiwan, and then using the war as this potential source of common ground between the two.
Great books, great movies, any storytelling, really. I think often the challenge is nailing the landing, right? How do you end the thing? And it's often not that easy. You give the last word to George Orwell. You write, you quote Orwell's famous, "Who controls the past controls the future." Why did you choose to end with that quote?
For me, it just summed it up. I found I kept coming back to Orwell at various points during the project as somebody who just articulated this so clearly, so long ago, and it just seemed that was so prescient, and that was. I felt that was really the approach all of these regimes were taking. That history was something that needed to be kept under tight control, and that if they could do a good enough job of exploiting and manipulating that past, that it would enable them to control the future. So, his words just really were, I guess, echoing around my head through various parts of the project. But I wanted to be clear that this is not just about the here and now. This has ramifications well into the future, and also that this is not necessarily unique to the current autocrats. This is not. There is no reason to believe that whoever comes to power after Putin won't similarly turn to the history of the war as something that can unite the country, and won't similarly try to stoke nationalism on the back of these national stories. So yeah, I wanted to be clear that this is a very long-lasting, durable story, and it's likely to continue. The exploitation of this history will likely continue beyond these current leaders and into all of our futures.
Well, Katie, once again, congratulations. The book is terrific. I highly recommend it to all of our viewers. And congratulations on reaching the finish line. I know how much hard work a book like this is, and I got to have a ringside seat to see you working on it from time to time when you were at the Wilson Center. So I know the work that goes into it. And I also want to tell our viewers that if you'd like to hear more from Katie about the book, on Thursday, May 19th, depending on when you're seeing this episode of Wilson Center Now, on Thursday, May 19th, Katie will be doing an event with Robert Daly, the director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China in the U.S., where they'll be discussing this book perhaps even more in depth than we just did today. So tune into that. And if you're watching this program after May 19th, just go to wilsoncenter.org and check the events tab, and you could find it archived as a previous event. Katie, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for all of the support. This book would not exist without the wonderful institution that is the Wilson Center.
That's very kind of you to say. Thanks. And to our viewers, hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.